Welcome to the program today. Mano Gonzalez here in studio with a prophecy update, and I have through Skype Bob McGinnis, an expert certainly on all things Middle East and Near East. And so we're going to try to give you an update on what we see going on with, again, just the geopolitics that are happening in our world. It's a crazy time to be watching, and things are changing moment by moment, day by day. Where they're going to end up are we going to end up in World War III? Well, we'll be finding out. But as Christians, we certainly want to stay informed, and no better person than Bob McGinnis. And Bob, welcome to the program today. You had written a book a few years ago, really the Alliance of Evil, and maybe talk about that book and then how it has made its way to your current, just recently released book, Kings of the East. So kind of, if you don't mind, give us a little background on that.
Well, in 2018, the Alliance of Evil was released, and I identified basically that we were engaged in a new Cold War. The old Cold War, as most people recall, ended in December of 1991 when the hammer and the sickle were lowered at the Kremlin in Moscow. And I marked that period of time with 16 indicators here recently of a new Cold War. And I kind of, went back and kind of revisited all those indicators that made the old Cold War what it was and what appears to be in the new Cold War. Now, meanwhile, of course, I lived in Europe. I was on the Iron Curtain for years. I've traveled to China and, of course, to places like the DMZ of Korea and, of course, right on the Iranian border with Iraq and Kuwait. So I've seen a bit of the totalitarian side of the world and what the Cold War of the old Cold War did. And so as I went through that in here recently, with the focus on the hegemonic rise of communist China, I said, yes, we are in Cold War, and I think more people today than 5 years ago when I wrote that book are beginning to agree, yeah, these are new times. And in fact, they're new times because the totalitarians, the authoritarians like President Xi of China and Vladimir Putin of Moscow and others, want to change the world order. After World War II, after the Cold War, we became certainly a liberal world order where civil liberties were promoted, international organizations were promoted, economic prosperity was promoted. But unfortunately, these authoritarians today do not want that. And they want to replace what we currently have with something more to their liking, something with Marxist values and very alien to what we're accustomed to in the United States. So, the idea of a Cold War, which I lived and saw firsthand, both in Moscow and throughout Western Europe along the Iron Curtain, and even into the demilitarized zone in Korea. That may have gone to the wayside, but the new Cold War is quite different, but very real and very dangerous, just as much as the old one was.
When we look at the current environment, would we expect that President Xi, that he is, what's his thoughts on the Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Is he okay with it? Is he against it? I mean, kind of give us an update on how publicly he is positioning or maneuvering himself.
Well, the Ukraine issue presents some special issues or frustrations for President Xi, of course, who's about to get his third term and chairmanship for life. Recall right before the Olympics of 2022 that President Xi met with Vladimir Putin. I think it was on the 21st, 22nd of February. And no doubt Putin said, yep, I've got all my forces staged outside of Ukraine. I'm going in. And, Xi was hoping that it wouldn't be as bloody and as frustrating, much less impacting the economy of the world as it has become. And here recently, for the first trip out of China since the pandemic, President Xi was in Uzbekistan meeting with the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, which is sort of a UN type of organization that includes authoritarians such as Vladimir Putin. So Putin met with Xi again at that meeting, and Putin admitted that Xi was not terribly happy about the impact of the Ukraine war. And so we find, though, that Xi has not publicly criticized Putin, and in fact, he's increased trade with Russia, primarily because they want the cheap oil and natural gas that Russia has plenty of. And so those issues are swirling about here as we face a growing crisis in Eastern Europe, one which has not drawn the criticism of the Chinese, but they would like to see it done differently. And of course, meanwhile, President Xi is contemplating his own Ukraine type of operation against his own people in the breakaway Republic of China and Taiwan. And that's always in the back of his mind. He's been promising to retake and bring Taiwan under the umbrella of Beijing since he became chairman back in 2013. So there are a lot of issues that are swirling here, Mondo.
So, I think in terms of, and I'm sure you do too, that do these guys really care about world public opinion, maybe even the UN? I mean, I know they're on the Security Council. Do they really fear any public backlash?
Well, if it doesn't have an economic impact on them, then the answer is no. And here recently, with the perception that the U.S. is weak and fading, and China is rising, that they're not nearly as concerned. If they were concerned about the international order that we currently have, Xi and Putin would have come to the UN when it had its General Assembly meeting in September, or they might have even appeared at Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, which they didn't. And so their concern about international, I suppose, approval of who they are doesn't really have a consequence for them unless it impacts them economically. Now, there's no doubt that the sanctions imposed on the Russians, Vladimir Putin has really squeezed his economy, but he's found outlets for his goods, primarily energy. The Indians are buying a lot of it. The Chinese are buying what's left. And of course, it's left us grappling for energy out of places like Venezuela. And of course, this administration won't pump our own gas or petroleum. So you have these issues at play. These people are totalitarians. They have every intention of taking over as much of the world as they can, and they could care less whether they're sanctioned by the UN or not. And they're going to continue pushing the goads as long as they can.
It's interesting because, prophetically speaking, we look and we recognize that there are no doubt the Bible teaches, Revelation 13 and other passages, that we're coming to, as the end of the age comes, during the tribulation period, the 7-year tribulation, there's going to be this new world order led by a single figure, maybe the 10 kings, certainly. But we also know that prophetically that the new world order at that time, that no doubt the Antichrist is given dominion over the majority of the world, but there still is some holdouts, some rebels, and we see that in the kings of the east and others. But right now, if you will, for those that might not truly understand, what are some of the segments? Give us maybe a lesson at who are the New World Order players, I mean, in the sense of the West. Who are the big regional players, and how do they fight against each other and position themselves?
Well, a lot of people, when you talk New World Order, think of the WEF, World Economic Forum, which meets in Davos. And of course, they were stood up basically by the Communist Chinese to serve their best interests. In fact, the director there in Davos, his son is an advisor to Xi, who's married to a Chinese lady in Beijing. The kind of the power brokers, the billionaires, the oligarchs around the world that are already through elite capture controlled to a certain degree by the likes of Xi, some of them, of course, by the likes of Vladimir Putin, who keep them in power, and likewise, they keep him in power. These power brokers see the opportunities to manipulate Western organizations to their liking, and they've done a very good job, unfortunately. And so they want a world order that is like the Pax Seneca, the idea that Chinese values, Marxist-Leninist values, permeate the entire world. They take over international organizations. And in fact, if you looked at even the UN today, a third of the principal organizations that are subordinate to the overall UN are run by Chinese diplomats. The Chinese have infiltrated so much of the international organizations that they're beginning to morph into something that they were never intended to be by, those of us in the West that embrace civil liberties and liberal values. So they're gradually, through their economic prowess and their manipulation, through programs like Belt and Road Initiative, which of course was put together at the behest of President Xi, and an idea that Wang Hongring, who is the Kissinger of China and the primary advisor to Xi, said, you need to go out there. And basically what they've done is go to 140 plus nations around the world, made basically loans of infrastructure using Chinese labor and Chinese goods. And now they manipulate that. Many of these countries, look at Sri Lanka, look at Ghana, look at Nigeria, look at certainly Greece, others that have taken Chinese money and now they weren't able to pay back, and so they're turning over control of their vast resources, control of their political systems, and that's how the Chinese are buying up the world. And it's like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, and they've already eaten most of this elephant, and we have to recognize that this system of control of world economic order, of new world order, is coming about in a way that is going to surprise us. It's much like the frog in the water that's being heated to a boiling point. Well, we never jumped out, even though we knew that things were happening.
It's amazing to watch these different players try to, maneuver for power and control. On that note, winter's coming, and the latest thing with the bombing of the Nord Stream. For our audience who might not understand, what are the theories behind who did it, and maybe some of the implications for the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, Nord Stream 1 and 2, of course, the natural gas that's being pumped in from the Russian Federation into Western Europe. Now, of course, it's noteworthy that Trump warned the Germans not to depend upon the Russians, not to finish Nord Stream 2. But, of course, Western Europeans, being as naive as they often are, went ahead and allowed the pipelines to be completed. Now, here a month or so ago, as they sat there in the bottom of the Baltic Sea, they were not pumping natural gas. They were closed because one was under maintenance, the other had not yet really started full operation. And so when they were blown up, hundreds of feet below the Baltic Sea, there was speculation as to who would benefit. Arguably, I would say that the beneficiary of that would be more likely to be the Russians, because Putin has been trying to put pressure on all sorts of fronts. And now it would appear as if Western Europe faces a deep freeze this winter, as they have insufficient natural gas. And, if you've recently been to Europe, Mondo, you'll see in places all over Western Europe, big piles of wood, trying to find some source of energy. They've reactivated or allowed the continuation of nuclear reactors, which they've tried to shut down for some time, just because they know they're in a crisis. They aren't going to have sufficient fuel. Now, there is speculation, of course, based upon President Biden's statements about Nord Stream that it would never come online if, in fact, Putin invaded Ukraine, which, of course, he did. Now, and so there's speculation that the U.S. took it out. I don't know anything about that firsthand. I can understand, people playing that video, but I think in all probability it was the Russians that did this just to put more pressure. After all, the Russians are having a very bad day. The last few weeks in Ukraine, they've lost territory to the Ukrainians. They've come under significant pressure because of the 12-mile-long bridge that connects Mother Russia with Crimea, which was annexed in 2014, was destroyed evidently by a truck bomb put there by the Ukrainian security forces. And of course, then you've had Putin. It's annexed 4 regions in eastern Ukraine. And you have renewal of bombardment and use of precision munitions against Ukrainian cities like Kyiv. And then, of course, here recently, you've had a new front being established out of Belarus. And Lukashenko, who is the president in Belarus, has been bought off by Putin with billions of dollars of loans. So, he's going to collaborate and cooperate, and that's going to draw forces from the east for the Ukrainian reserves, and then give the Russians, who have mobilized an additional 300,000 personnel, to have a better chance of making inways into eastern and southern Ukraine. So these issues are arguably complex. My concern is that the U.S. may become too involved as a result of being a member of NATO, and that this could be something that could spread much further than just Ukraine.
Yeah, some of the things in the sense of the stuff that I've been watching is, some of the way that the situation has changed, and that especially recently, Putin's like, well, once he announced the annexation of these territories, he's like, okay, now it's part of us, we're going to defend it. Do you think that, it's going to go, now that they're doing these fresh attacks on Kiev, do you think that is like last week's news, that now he's going to have to be committed to go farther into occupying most of Ukraine?
Well, at the beginning, obviously, his intent was to decapitate Ukrainian government by going from the north, from Belarus into Kyiv, and then destroying Zelensky and that government, and therefore cause them to surrender. That was his initial plan, not a very well thought out plan, obviously. And then he reverted to the east and to the south. He does want to resurrect the old empire under Nicholas of the 19th century, and that would include those provinces that he annexed, as well as all the way down to Odessa and the seacoast, and that would be part of the old empire. Putin has never made a secret over the last decades. He's been in power, arguably 23 years, and he's always, been concerned about what Gorbachev did, and really caving into the West and destroying the old Soviet Union. So Putin wants to resurrect it. He wants to reclaim much of the lost territory. And that's in part what the Ukrainian fight is all about. And at this point, he's not going to give up. He'll do everything that he possibly can within his power to retake, and not just the East, but much of Ukraine if given the opportunity. If not this year, then he'll do it next or the year after. And then, of course, he's not very happy with the accession of Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance. But what we're doing, arguably, is a proxy war with Russia anyway. And it's the NATO nations that are feeding the weapons, especially the U.S., to the Ukrainians that are being so successful against a not well-led, not well-provisioned Russian force. So this whole enterprise of the fighting in Eastern Europe could accelerate if we're not careful. And I am of the position that if Putin is put into the corner more than he already is, he has a lot of domestic pressure. He has a lot of oligarch and elite pressure. If this continues, it's not beyond his capability and willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Now, keep in mind, a week or so ago, he made it very clear there's been I suppose, a pretext of sorts. The United States used nuclear weapons against Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. And so he said, look, I'm at war right now. If becomes necessary, will revert to using all resources as necessary to win that which I seek. And though he doesn't have total cooperation in his own country, there are still those that are buying into this idea. And the criticism is not coming out of Beijing. It's not coming out of any of his partners, whether they're in the Middle East or Africa or elsewhere in the world. So these are troubled times.
Do you think that, would it be simple as if Ukraine came out publicly and said, okay, Russia has annexed these territories, we officially relinquish any claim to them, is the war over?
No, well, I don't think Zelensky would do that. It'd have to be another government. But, the U.S. should have stopped this war long before it started. Although a year ago I wrote for Fox News that there was a better than 50-50 chance of war in Ukraine. And I was criticized for that, but obviously ended up being correct in my analysis. We could have stopped it, but I think the weakness coming out of the Afghanistan fiasco by the Biden administration left us in a very weakened state. We didn't take deliberate action. We could have armed up Ukraine if we felt it was necessary, and we waited until after the shots were fired. So there was a series of classic second-tier mistakes by the Biden administration, which brought us to the point that Putin felt that he could risk what he risked and launch an attack in there. Now, clearly he didn't anticipate NATO would lean in as heavily as they did with arming the Ukrainians, and he overestimated his own capability, his armed forces, and he didn't really assess how effective the Ukrainian military had become. And they had. We'd been working with them for decades, since the end of the Cold War, and arming them rather well. And of course, they've been effective. But the Russian military has been a major disappointment. And so that has resulted in Putin relying upon his inner circle to advise him on plans and policies, and his ministers are fearful of him. So it's really a tenuous situation in Moscow, much less in Ukraine.
So as kind of wrapping up that, not that it's wrapped up, Putin cannot walk away and be satisfied and save face really anyway, right?
Well, only if he can negotiate some sort of end to hostilities. Now, mobilizing 300,000 indicates that he's going to continue to press. And the fact that the other day that he launched precision guidance into Kiev is a very clear message that he's not quitting anytime soon. So I suspect this little war is going to continue. What I hope doesn't happen is it escalates any more than it has, and then brings NATO into it, because NATO is involved. That means we're involved directly, and we don't need that.
What are the chances of Biden, or I know he's offered the advanced air defense systems, what are the chances of those actually being implemented into the field?
That is a concern. A TACMS, which would be used by HIMARS, which we've given HIMARS launchers and missiles, but they've been limited to 45, 48 miles. The ATACMS that they're talking about now would allow a range of 200 miles, which would reach deeply into Russia, not quite to Moscow. And so if you give that capability to Ukrainians, as well as F-16s and other aircraft, they will use it. And they'll use it, for sovereign reasons, to protect themselves and to hurt their enemy deep in their own territory. That expands the war. And that's why I'm very concerned that if you put that sort of pressure on Putin, he's more than likely to use all his inventory to his own benefit, and that includes nuclear weapons.
Well, Bob, I appreciate your time today and giving us this prophecy update. We did another program for those watching on Bob's new book, Kings of the East, which I highly recommend. You can be on the lookout for that program coming. But it's interesting that Bob has come to be very prophetic in his book, Alliance of Evil, all the way into his latest book, just coming out hot off the presses, giving an entire background in history and really future look at the kings of the East, the Chinese Empire, and what they're seeking to do. And they're not walking away quietly. So, Bob, again, appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mondo. Have a great day.
Yeah. For those watching, again, we're going to continue to give you prophecy updates, bringing in the experts, talking to them, and seeing, again, encouragement. Bob's a solid believer. He ends the Kings of the East book on again, a solid note of faith. And that's why we're here to point people to the gospel, that God's in control. We know that. So appreciate you watching this week, and we'll see you next time.